Over the past 50 years or so, there have been a number of surveys every year about teenagers' aspirations as a way to kind of track, their sense of values and what they find important. A survey of what they would like most out of life, and there are a number of things that you would expect that over the past 50 years or so that have shown up in these surveys. Things like would like a good job, or things like I want to be happy, things like that I want my family to prosper. And not surprisingly, things like I want to make a lot of money. Totally understandable. Who doesn't want to make a lot of money? But as they have done this survey over the decades, there's been this interesting shift. There's been this interesting dynamic, or an interesting aspiration that has begun to show more and more as one of the top 1 or 2, 3 things that teenagers desire the most. That desire is the simple desire to be famous. Not necessarily to be famous for having accomplished something great, not necessarily to be famous for inventing something new, but just the desire to be famous. It's an interesting aspiration, but in some ways it makes sense over the past 5, 10 years that we're beginning to see this ideal for what it means to be successful in life, to be famous. In an age of Twitter followers, the number of Twitter followers, in an age in which we track how many repostings of our Facebook page, and this day and age in media of selfies and YouTube stars, we often can maybe understand how this idea of being famous has become such a significant marker to people's lives. And psychologists and sociologists kind of try to analyze, what is this being famous, and why has that become more and more a reality of aspiration for young people? And they can identify, maybe it's in a sense the materialism of our culture. It's in a sense this mass media age in which we live, in which the immediacy of interactions with total strangers, and the desire to be famous seems maybe a natural aspect of this. But one of the interesting things that a number of these sociologists and psychologists point out is they believe in many ways this desire to be famous, which, to be honest, if you're like me, I was kind of, well, that's a rather shallow thing. But the desire to be famous is actually reflective of the disconnection we have in our community. That the desire to be famous, to make fool of oneself as a reality TV star, is rooted in this reality that no one really knows each other that well. That often this desire to be famous is a way to connect to other human beings, even if it is over the internet. And to realize that in the end, someone knows who they are. To be famous is more desire to be known by another human being. Because the reality is, in our communities, in our society, those opportunities don't exist as much. And we can grieve that and feel sad about that, but what struck me often over the past few years, and this is an odd observation, but I think an accurate one, over the past 2 or 3 years, as we've seen mass shootings occur more and more, as we wrestle with this sense of this violence, and even as we debate political issues of gun safety and those kinds of things, they'll talk about mental illness, and those are important places and spaces for conversation for people. But what has struck me about those who perpetuate these crimes, what has struck me more often than not, is that they are people disconnected from the communities around them. So disconnected that they find in information left behind by the so-called shooters, so disconnected that what they are desiring in the mass shooting, a number of them have left in notes and posts on media, a number have said, I want to be famous. And I try to wrap my head around that sense in which people feel so isolated. The only way they can be known is if they kill as many people as possible. In that they will be relevant, important, famous. Think about that such brokenness, not just in individuals, but within our society, in which someone doesn't feel recognized to the extent that they would do such horrible things. I always wonder, what if there had been one person who made them feel relevant? Just one person. How many lives would that have saved? It's a question that kind of haunts me. Back in the late 60s, there was a philosopher, Guy Debord was his name, and he wrote a treatise on philosophy in which he described what he said is, we live now in this postmodern age in a society of spectacle. That we live in a day and age right now where image takes preeminence over anything else. That we love the spectacle, right? And that takes priority and importance as far as conveying or communicating something about who we are as individuals, as communities. We love the big, the spectacle, because big is relevant, right? That's why we have blockbuster movies, bigger and bigger and bigger. It's why folks worry about the size of inauguration crowds, because big is better. That's why we are concerned that we have a lot of Twitter followers or Facebook friends or whatever, because more is more relevant, isn't it? And lest we find ourselves thinking, well, this isn't really what it means. It's not necessarily, that's a strange thing. It's those young teenagers who are a little crazy. How often do we measure the church by how big it is, right? The spectacle. Maybe you've heard me say that it's always the metric we often use for church of the 3 B's. Buildings, big buildings, lots of bucks, and we want a lot of butts in the pews, right? How much energy do we spend on those 3 B's? How much do we focus on those as if that is the metric that defines who we are? And don't get me wrong, those 3 B's are important. And yet, that is the spectacle that we really focus on. How much have we, what has become the spectacle of our culture and society and church when we kind of yearn a little bit or look down the road and say, oh, I wish we had the mega church, right? Or the celebrity pastor or preacher more than anything. But that's so much a part of our worldview that bigger is better is more a sign of faithfulness, is more a descriptor of whether we're doing our job or not, that becomes the metric of our discipleship. And what's weird about that is none of those three B's show up in the Gospels, do they? All right, we don't have a description in the Gospels that Jesus never settled in one place, practically. Much less spent a lot of time focusing on buildings. And he had a lot to say about a relationship towards money, questions of discipleship, but we all know that he was a person who didn't have a lot of wealth and never articulated much to the contrary to those who preach the prosperity wealth gospel, which is an interesting spectacle created these days. And I'll be honest, Jesus was horrible at evangelism. Think about it. He was awful. He could have used a good advertising company. Come on. You're not going to get a lot of people, hey, if you want to follow me, die to yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. My God, that's not going to be just do it. That's not going to work. If you want to follow me, give away all your possessions to the poor and follow me. I'm sure people were lining up for that, right? And over again, we see, we even imagine, or we think about the spectacle stories about Jesus' miracles and his healing, that these were huge spectacles that attracted large crowds. And there is some evidence in the gospel, but almost invariably, over and over, Jesus would say, hey, don't talk about that. And the truth is, he died on the cross alone, abandoned by himself, and by all measures of the reality of this world, he died irrelevant. A small life in the small part of the backwoods country in this huge, big empire. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, the smallest of all the seeds. What could he mean by that? It's anti-spectacle, it's anti-relevancy, it's anti-big. It's the exact opposite of that. What could he be meaning by saying the kingdom of God, the presence of God, the reality of God's love and grace is present, is like a mustard seed, the tiniest and smallest of seeds. Robert Capon, he's an Episcopal priest who wrote he wrote a trilogy of books on the parables. And it was a fascinating reflection on the parables. And he wrote, they kind of combined these three books because they became fairly famous among preachers and people who study the Bible. And he wrote an introduction, and in this introduction, he kind of gave his theology about who Jesus was. And one of the most central points, he said, if one reads Jesus' parables, one of the central points is that Jesus over and over and over again rejects what he calls right-handed power. That Jesus over and over again rejects the right-handed power of the empire, the Roman Empire, or the sense that God is about power over other people. Capone's argument is that Jesus embraced what he called a left-handed kind of power. Not power over, but connection to and love to. That in fact, Capone argues, as you look through the whole Gospels, it's obvious. The very beginning of his ministry, the very temptations Satan gives to him is take right-handed power, rule over the nations. Be all-powerful, you're God. Be big, be a spectacle. And you're going to get people to follow you. And the truth is, if one reads through the Gospels, there are points at which there are crowds around, but over and over it's repeated. If you look deeply enough, they begin to run away from him as fast as they can because he's preaching something, not power, but something completely opposite. Jesus doesn't assign himself, he doesn't identify himself with those in power. Over and over, who he identifies with are the powerless. And that God's love exists not power over people, but being with people. And he claims all his parables are about these simple things, these small things that can be avenues in which we glimpse God's presence, when often what we're doing is we're looking to the clouds for the clouds to part, and we fail to see the seeds, the tiny seeds, not the spectacle, but the tiny things that are ever present in our life, that's where the kingdom of God is. And that really is a left-handed kind of power, in a sense, a left-handed kind of way of looking at the world, not how the world thinks what is important, but the reality that God's kingdom is present in the small. You're not called this week to some grand gesture of power, of faithfulness. What you're called is to identify, to connect to the seeds of the kingdom that are around you. It may be when you go into work tomorrow, you see a co-worker who's kind of down, you notice that, and you ask them out to coffee. That's such a small thing. That's the kingdom. It may be this week you have an opportunity to forgive. I know your spouse. I know my wife will have an opportunity to forgive me this week. But that's such a small thing to say, I'm sorry. Forgive me. It's the smallest thing in the world. But maybe this week you have an opportunity to connect to a kid who's struggling and to say to them, you're important. That's a small thing, isn't it? That there are seeds every day, small ones, if we but pay attention, can make a difference. Because it's true. It isn't the big things that change the world, it's the small things. It's Rosa Parks. Said, no, I'm not going to move from my seat. That's a mustard seed of the kingdom. It's a woman who says, I'm going to tell my story. Me too. To my family, to my friends. That's a small thing. Voting. Such a tiny thing to do. And yet it changes the world. I think just within the past week or two, I happened to come upon this book by a man named, it was by a New York Times reporter. It was about a man named Derek Black, who I'd never heard of before. And the book was titled Rising Out of Hate. And it tells the story of Derek Black. Now, Derek Black was born basically into the white nationalism movement. His father was the founder, I don't even know the name of this, which I'm kind of glad, of what's called on the internet Stormfront, which is the largest white nationalist organization in the United States. His father founded that. His godfather was David Duke, the former wizard of KKK. And by the time that Derek was 19 years old, he already was hosting his own daily radio show about white nationalism. And as he was homeschooled and raised in this reality, it was part of who he was. In fact, he was identified by other white nationalists as the leading light going into the future. And he would articulate that it's so important to infiltrate our societies and to see this white nationalism come to fruition. And he was an adamant part of who he was. It was this big thing he was focused on. And even though homeschooled, he did go off to college. Small liberal arts school. It's an interesting aspect of how he chose to go there to infiltrate that school. And he didn't let the other students know who he was. In fact, every morning he would host his daily radio show and keep it secret from the other students that he was doing this. He'd go to class, participate in the life of that college. But somehow word got out. And you can imagine, college campus, it blew up, right? And other students protested him, and others denounced him, and he found himself in conflict with those around him. And yet that made him even more adamant in his beliefs. Until a Jewish student invited him over for a Shabbat, a meal, and invited him every week to gather at that meal and meet the people at that table. And he says it transformed him. Just that simple seed of an invitation to eat together, to share our stories, transformed a lifetime of hate and racism. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.